and welcome to Sage Politics Webinar Week. Our webinar this afternoon is called Teaching the Next Generation of Policymakers How to Prepare Them for the Challenges Ahead, presented by Arjen Boin and Martin Lodge. My name is Fawzia Eastwood, and I'm a marketing manager at Sage for the books portfolio, Politics Books portfolio. I'm a cisgender woman of South Asian background. I have medium-length brown hair, brown eyes, and olive skin. I'm wearing a black dress and jumper. My pronouns are she, her. Before we start, I'd like to share some webinar housekeeping information. We're recording this webinar, however, we switched off the cameras and muted the microphones for all participants except the presenters and hosts. This is so that everyone will be able to enjoy the session without background noise. The chat box won't be available for participants during this webinar. If you do have questions, please do write them in the question and answer box, and we'll reply to as many of those as we can during the session, with some answered live by the presenters. And then we'll try to follow up with any of those that we didn't get around to answering today. Please do take advantage of our presenters' expertise and focus any questions you may have around the content of today's webinar. As mentioned, the webinar is being recorded, and we'll upload the recorded video onto Sage's YouTube channel over the coming weeks. We'll also share it via email and on our X page. We've made closed captions available during this webinar, so do switch those on if they're helpful for you. Sage is a global academic publisher of books, journals, and library resources with a growing range of technologies to enable discovery, access, and engagement. Our mission is building bridges to knowledge, supporting the development of ideas through the research process to scholarship that is certified, taught, and applied across all fields of social science. Whether you're preparing a course, conducting research, or looking to publish your next research paper, our Sage Politics and International Relations portfolios provide top quality, easy to access materials to help you make the most of and the best use of your time and excel in your field. We're delighted to introduce today's webinar, which is on the theme of policymaking, presented by authors Arjen Boin and Martin Lodge. Their upcoming book, The Politics of Policymaking, from Sage, is publishing at the end of this month and will be referenced during this webinar. You can find out more about their book at our website, www.sagepub.co.uk, or if you scan the QR code that you see on the screen. Attendees of today's webinar can get 25% discount using the code POLWEBWEEK, or if you're a lecturer, you can request an electronic inspection copy. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome and I'd like to introduce you to our presenters. Arjen Boin is Professor of Public Institutions and Governance at the Institute of Political Science, Leiden University. Before he moved to Leiden, he was Professor of Public Governance and Crisis Management at the Utrecht School of Governance and Associate Professor at the Public Administration Institute, Louisiana State University. Arjen has published widely on topics of crisis and disaster management, leadership, institutional design, and organizational issues. His most recent book is The Politics of Policymaking, published by Sage and out later this month. Other recent titles include Palgrave's Guardians of Public Value, Understanding the Creeping Crisis, and Governing the Pandemic. His book, Managing Hurricane Katrina, published by Louisiana State University in 2019, investigates the lessons that should be learned from this mega disaster. Arjen is also former editor of the Public Administration Journal from Wiley and serves on the editorial board of the following journals: the Journal of Contingencies and Crisis Management from Wiley, Risks, Hazards and Crisis in Public Policy, also by Wiley, and International Journal of Emergency Management, published by Indie Science. Martin Lodge is professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science and has been member of the Department of Government since 2002 and is currently director for the Centre of Analysis of Risk and Regulation, CARR. Martin was also a member of the Trans-Crisis Research Consortium, a Horizon 2020 project on transboundary crisis management capacities. This 3-year project was hosted by CAR. In addition, he is a founding member of the Political Studies Association Specialist Group on Executive Politics and Governance, co-editor of the Palgrave book series of the same name, and he is the co-chairperson of the IPSA Research Committee on the Structure and Organization of Government. He has also co-written The Politics of Policymaking from Sage. A huge welcome to you, Arjen and Martin.
Well, thank you, Fawzia. It's a very nice introduction. and Martin and I are delighted to be here. And today we want to talk about the way we have been teaching policy, policymaking studies, and the way we look at it is both Martin and I have been studying problems. We're very problem focused, crisis, wicked problems, all sorts of problems, and that has convinced us. And of course, I'm not saying anything new here. That we need both smart policies and smart policy makers. And Martin and I have been teaching young people, but also experienced practitioners. Um, and we're trying, and this is always the challenge, to take theories and empirical insights and somehow package that in a way that people can learn something and apply that in practice and make the policies that would then ideally make for a better government and better policies. So that's what we want to talk about, and specifically because our experience and all the challenges we've encountered in the past years have inspired us to write a book. And so we want to talk about that process, why we wrote the book and what's in it. And hopefully you'll find that of interest. So let me start with the background. And Martin will jump in if I'm doing anything wrong here. So the way we look at this world, and we're getting a little older, is by saying, well, the world has changed a little bit, and it's not become easier for people who work for government and have to make policy. So if you look at the last couple of years, and you looked at the technological changes that have been quite revolutionary in the past years, whether it's artificial intelligence, something that we're really struggling with in the university, but everybody's struggling with what are we going to do with that? But just cyber, the world of cyber, and the dependency of cyber, but also very specific technologies like DNA editing or drones, and they're changing the environment. Of course, we're living in a more volatile environment. We've always had conflicts, we've always had wars, but they just seem to be a little more dangerous now than they have been over the past decades. We've been going through the Ukraine Russia war, the Israel Hamas war right now, and so it's but there's many areas, whether we're looking in Africa or Ecuador or Haiti right now, there are just very hot zones everywhere. And our societies are indirectly and directly uh, you know meet the consequences of that. And whether we're talking about the declining trust levels in our society, trust in each other, trust in government, trust in politicians, or issues like inequality, um, and that creates demands for policies. And of course, the big elephant in the room is climate change. We have no idea what's going to happen, but we all understand something must happen. And I think that is a fair description of the predicament that policymakers are in, knowing you have to do something, but you have no idea if you can do anything right now that matters. And you certainly don't have any idea of the unintended consequences that any sort of new policies may generate. Well, when we talk about all these things and we ask our students, what do you think are the problems that government must deal with? They might not come up exactly with these categories, but many of the problems that they come up with, that they're experiencing in their own life, are directly related to these. So serious problems, and that is also creating challenges for people who work in government, work for government, or with government. And the problems, as we analytically sort of can line them up here, is the first one is, in every textbook you'll find some story about wicked problems. And it just seems that we are having more and more wicked problems. In fact, we're running out of vocabulary to make a distinction between what is not a wicked problem, because simple problems don't seem to exist anymore. And so we're coming to new terms like super wicked problems. And that's all over the textbooks. Everything is changing all the time, and our environments are becoming more complex because our systems, our technological, social technological systems are becoming more complex. Now, another thing that I think really came out in the COVID period and in many societies is the sense of political opportunism. So the idea that short wins are better than long-term thinking. So they're crowding out the ideas that may have a longer term value over the easy wins, and that has had a great effect on the trust in public government, especially in politicians, one might add. And social media, we keep talking about it, and I mean it's not a new problem by now. We're talking about it for 10 years, but I don't think we've really have an idea how to handle it. And finally, the internationalization of many developments, threats, transboundary threats, just make it very hard for national or locally based governments to come up with solutions. So if you look at this, this is a pretty dark picture, a pretty pessimistic picture of the world we're in and the challenges that policymakers face. So then it becomes what do we tell our students? So what is our take on this? Now, I will say if you, and I think many of the people who teach policy and write books on policy will share this, is that there's always been a tendency to say, oh, everything's getting worse. Things are always getting more complex. We're all getting more problems. So, and in a way, you might also say that the way we've been making policy has also created many of the successes, the good things that are going on in society. So we can't just say, oh, we got to throw everything out. We're not calling for a revolution, but we do see a discrepancy between policy making practices that have been institutionalized over, let's say since the World War II in the past 60, 70 years, and the new world that we're entering. And in our view, we're really talking about smart adaptation, or one might say responsible modernization. And so we're not talking about a normative adjustment, and people need to be good or we need to do more of this, but really about adaptation of the policy making processes and maybe also the capacities needed to do that. So when we talk about the need for well-trained policymakers, we're thinking about the people are just not just well-trained, but also trained to be adaptive and to be ready to deal with these new environments. And that I think requires something from the teachers. Increasingly, we're going to have to be interdisciplinary. We're going to have to draw from many other fields, and we're going to have to be cross-cultural because there's a clear realization that the old way of looking at things, especially from the Western policy books, they need that needs adaptation as well. And of course, finally, what we think is really important is the passion to make a difference. So to instill a passion in the next generation of policymakers that they can actually make a difference, and that the world is not so hard or the problems are not so big that there's a sense of pessimism, what can I do? Now, in the classroom, and that's where we spend most of our time, we encounter, let's say, two types of students. The 18-year-old student who comes in and doesn't really know anything about government, and frankly, has no interest in government, even when they select a course on public administration, but often they just have to take these courses. And but there's also a whole group, and Martin will talk about that group, of practitioners who come back to school because they realize that they need a new toolbox skill set to deal with all these new problems. Now, what we're finding with the young group is that they find anything, if you just present stories about government policymakers, as utterly boring. And the courses, they don't select the course, that they're forced upon them, and frankly, you know, it can be pessimistic, and we lack exciting success stories. Recently, our colleague Paul Hart has started a whole project on successful policymaking, just to highlight successes, and I think that's a great shift. But we need to convince our students, who see many of the problems that they talk about as a direct consequence of government failure, that government can actually be a force for good and can bring solutions. Now, the books that we use and the articles that we use, we're lucky. We really have excellent colleagues who write fantastic stuff, and that we can draw upon. But at the same time, many of the existing textbooks for the 18-year-olds are simply too difficult, we find. And that is because they take theory as a starting point, which is great for students who want to get into the study of policymaking and the study of government. They need to understand the theories. They need to be, well acquainted with the theories, need to be able to work with the theories, criticize the theories, understand the definitions, the concepts, the causality, and all that. But the 18-year-olds, in order to get some sort of passion going with these kids, so they begin to believe in the idea that they might start a career in government, those books are not going to do the trick in our view. But Martin will say something about the practitioners, because of course that's a different audience. And I don't know if the practitioners read more than our 18-year-olds, because our 18-year-olds don't like reading, or most of them. They don't have a passion for reading thick books on policy theory. But Martin, what would you say about the practitioners?
I mean, I think we're highlighting here two distinct audiences that also were as part of the pitch for this. So one is a classroom challenge, as Arjen highlighted, people who need an entry book into core issues, to structure, to possibly generate some enthusiasm that there's a literature out there that actually speaks to the day-to-day problems they encounter, rather than something quite remote, and without overburdening these audiences with concepts and such like. So it needs an entry text that appeals to the day-to-day experience. For the practitioner too, of course, there are sort of two markets, one might sort of say, for these. There are sort of the specialist executive courses, and then there are sort of courses which are largely about structuring, you may want to say, diffuse understanding, the working in a silo or in one particular, the proverbial cubicle, without sort of understanding the broader flow or why something might look the way it does. And again, sort of here the challenge is not to start with, you may want to call it the top 4 journal article, but offer, you might say, a comprehensive integrated treatment to the student. And if they then become enthusiasts, that they have ability to move onwards. But in our experience, existing textbooks possibly speak already to an advanced understanding of the literature. Try to summarize that rather than seek to provide for a bridge between the daily existence, one might say, and you might say the academic observation of public policy.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. But I think what we agree on, that both the young people and the people obviously who pay to go to these courses to come back to school, they have a passion for the public cause. So they really do want to make things better. And it is something that just needs to be channeled towards the idea that policy making is a calling that you can follow in order to live that passion. And I find that every time when I work with the kids, that once you get them to understand that they can be a change agent, if you will. Then they become enthusiastic, and then they really want to learn, and that is the driving force for us to present an introductory text that can fire up that passion. That, I mean, I think if I want to put it in a few lines, that's how I would give our driving motivation for writing this. So we wanted to write a book for people who really don't know anything about government and policymaking. So really not take anything for granted. Make it very accessible, so it's easy reading, and not dumb it down, but just translate the important concepts and theories in a way of talking to the student that both enlightens and enthuses. That is the idea. So enthusiasm resonates in our way we talk to the students. So we are believers. We are not pessimists. We believe that things can change, and that government can drive change, and that people can, even at a very low level, entry level in the government can make a difference. And we want to take the student by the hand and offer a text that brings them into that world, understands how that world works, and what chances and opportunities it offers to students. So we have many examples, and we've been looking for examples. We know many examples of how things can be done, and not just recently, but in the past, in different areas, and also with a forward-looking sort of towards those problems that we just mentioned, how you can apply that. Now, to be sure, we are very, should I say, classically oriented, because we love our classics. So we are building on all the classics, and we're taking not just from policy, but from political science, public administration, sociology, and we're taking all the good stuff, and it's all in that book, because we want to make sure that the students understand that there's been a lot of study, and we know a lot. And of course, we selected the critical topics, and I think in the selection of the critical topics, we're not revolutionary because they're critical topics, and we don't reinvent them. And the way we set up the whole book is with an eye on if our colleagues would, because we understand that every teacher wants to build their own course. We might have a certain order in which we want to do a course, but every teacher should be able to take. So these chapters that we're building are standalone chapters. So there's a clear sequence, a clear red thread, but you can easily change all that stuff around. That's the way we wrote it. And to give you an idea, we will give you the I'm passing one, the contents, and if you just slide over the contents, anybody's ever seen a policy book will recognize that all the critical topics are in here. And I might add, we do add a little more room than usually to the moral dimension of policymaking, and that's because that really came out during COVID, how important that is. In the final chapter, we really talk to the students, what do you need to be a good policymaker? And we relate that to leadership. And not just in a sort of happy, everybody has to be, this leader, but in terms of a classical conception from Selznick, in terms of building institutions and the work that goes into that, and what you need to rise through a policymaking administration, if you want to really make that a career. But as you can see, we start with the problems, we go through the normal cycle of the policymaking. We do criticize the some of the myths that live in policy land, and offer up some some truths. But all in all, I think this is a very classical setup, but the difference is really in the tone that we use, and in the optimism, and in the language, and in the simplicity. So that, I think, is where we're trying to make a difference. So we have a real introduction, if you will. Now, we do offer, as in many books, the things that make it a little easier for students to retain knowledge. So we have little assignments that they could do themselves, that are we've tried to come up with a real variety of examples from all over the world. So we're trying to sort of escape from our Eurocentrism, which that's where we're from. So we have to work, but we did try that. And my favorite part is selecting the favorite readings from all the way back to Merton, and to the newest gems from colleagues. And we list them, and the idea being telling students, like, look, if you're getting into this, here are some really cool readings that you're going to enjoy. And so we give the pitches, and I think that's really also shows the student how much there is out there. So we're trying to be ambassadors of the field as well. So Mark, do you want to add anything to this? Okay, excellent. So then I'll go to, that was our story, and maybe we can answer some questions. And I think Fawzi is going to
Thank you.
help us through this part.
That was a wonderful description of the way that policy making can actually be positioned in a way to help more students engage with the topic. Thank you very much for that, Arjen and Martin. We are actually inviting people, participants, to please do submit your questions into the question and answer, the Q&A box at the bottom there. So if you have your questions or any comments that you want to add, please do write them in that box, and we will answer some of them live. Arjen and Martin will answer some of those live for you during this webinar. And actually, Arjen and Martin, some questions did come in advance through the registration process from participants. So while people are writing in the Q&A box, I would like to ask a couple of these to you, if that's okay. I'm going to kick off with one that came through, very interesting one here. From Nikos Zahariadis. This one was, Nikos is asking, in the era of ascending extremism, extremists seem to control the policy agenda, and what needs to change for moderates to gain?
Shall I give this a go, Arjen, and then you can correct me? So I think both Arjen and I approach the study of public policy making through what one might say is a traditional approach of policy analysis that one needs, or that students need, or every citizen should have a good understanding of and in the policy process, as Laswell defined it. And in many ways, as Arjen outlined, this is an introduction that seeks to encourage enthusiasm among individuals, citizens, to be participants of and in the policy process, to be more informed, to be willing to participate. And while Nikos, that might not necessarily be the only recipe to move everyone back to moderation, but in that sense, being an active citizen is arguably the best way to deal with questions of citizen disconnection and alienation from the public sphere in my case. But Arjen may have an alternative take on this.
Well, in the book, we certainly broach this issue, because we sketch how this sort of fragmenting environment makes it hard for policymakers, and we make the point, almost warning policymakers that, okay, you're trying to do good, but in doing good, you can also feed into this. So the awareness of the consequences of policy making and the policies you make and the way you make policy is very important. So, okay, the taking back the policy agenda We talk about agenda in the book. And I think we make the point that policymakers can't control that agenda, so I don't think there's a matter of taking it back. But we certainly make the point that it's not just a bunch of people out there, throwing out bad ideas, whatever. Policymakers have influence. I mean, they can start by listening and trying to make policies that people want. And that's not just the politicians. That's also there's a responsibility for policymakers to think through whether the consequences of the policies fit with sort of common conceptions of what good government is and what the quality of a policymaking apparatus should be. And that requires an active sort of outlook and not just an inward looking, but also an outward looking perspective on policymaking. And we really stress that in the book, that policymaking is not just a technical activity. It's not just something you do and then, whatever happens, and sort of an instrumental view on that. But we sketch the different logics that need to be taken into account of good policymaking. Now, I'm not going to say that's solve everything, but I do say it is something I am convinced, not just young people, but especially practitioners that we encounter, they need to understand that, maybe a little better than they do. And the sooner we start with that sort of almost indoctrination, if you will, I know that's a heavy term, but with sort of really imposing kind of the ethics of policymaking, if you will. And so that would be my my answer in addition to Martin's.
So in short, we want policymakers, whether they're in government or outside government, to see policymaking as a craft among professionals that people appreciate. One has to encounter with a degree of humility. And that's it.
Thank you for speaking. I like that where you say it should be seen as a craft with an element of humility. That's a nice takeaway.
I can't really hear you, but perhaps you could turn up your microphone just a little bit.
Sorry, that was my fault.
Yes,
so very good takeaways there. Thank you very much for speaking to that question. I do have another question here that came through in the chat just now. And this one is from Ethel Yates, and he's asking, to what degree do you give weight to the policy cycle?
Yeah, so the we addressed that in the first chapter because pretty much every book is based on a policy cycle, sort of the life of a policy, if you will, and it's very we give weight into the it's a good starting idea. This if you say, okay, there has to be some sort of an idea that something needs to happen, so you get through the agenda, and then you get selection, and you get prioritization, selection of tools, and then you go implement, and you evaluate, and then you change. So sort of the policy cycle. But we immediately from the beginning explain that that's just a descriptor of a process, and that's not reality. So in reality, it doesn't work like that. So we immediately demonstrate to the students that, look, we're going to organize our topics in this way, but it would be a mistake to think that there's a tabula rasa. You're just sitting there, you're going to design stuff, and then you're just going to wait till you see the effects. And then, so this is where also the title of our book comes in, The Politics of Policymaking. The political dimension of it all is going to make it messier. And we don't criticize it in a theoretical way. We just demonstrate that it's in reality things are much more complex, dynamic, whatever you want to call it. But we make sure the students understand that it's just a tool to organize a discussion. So that's how we use that policy cycle. But we don't. So the proverbial circle of the policy circle, we present that in chapter 1, and then we say, there's something mythical about this, and we're not gonna overly criticize it. We just move on. So that's how we deal with that. And there's a sample chapter on the Sage website, and so you can read that in the first chapter. You'll find that quickly enough, and then you can see how we deal with that.
Fantastic, thank you. And yes, if you go onto the SAGE website, as Arjen mentioned, that will be there for you to read the sample chapter on that. Another question which came through actually in advance here, this is from Zalina, who's a lecturer at the University Utara, Malaysia. She's asking how to lessen or reduce the gap between theories and practice, for example, real world examples.
Well, I think our book is an exercise in that. So the theories, many of the theories are a helpful way of understanding certain research questions, and that academics pose. And then they want to understand something, and they have a theory, and they build, and it's fantastic work. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can use that as a guide to understand the world of policy. So we turn that on its head. So first of all, we talk about a lot about, what does the world look like that you're going to walk into? So if you're going to take a job in government, you're going to be making policy. I mean, what are you finding? What are you experiencing? What does that world look like? And we don't use any theory there, but once we get to the point where we're saying, the challenges that you encounter on the work floor, and we want to explain where these challenges come from, or how in general these challenges might be solved, then we use theory to produce our answer. But first we give our answer, and only if students have a real need to understand the underlying theory will we then talk about that theory. But that is really it's not the main part. So we're not just like going through, we have to go through all these theories. Now we do discuss them, but they're subjugated to our aim of explaining how that world works and how policymakers can make a difference in that world. So I hope that answers the question a little bit. Martin, do you want to say?
If I may, just offer, sort of broadens this up a bit. I think both a challenge for a book like this, and the reader has to decide on its success or not, but also for the classroom itself, is to stimulate, in a way, students also to use examples that are not always immediate to their own sector or their own interests. So in that sense, so one of the key challenges in the classroom, especially when one has on the more, let's say, executive side of teaching, this is not what I witness every day because I only do job A, and there's an example from job B, so I don't care. And in many ways, this is both a challenge for a book like this, but also for a challenge for a teacher teaching with this book to basically encourage people to be, that there will be better policymakers if they look across boundaries. And that is that's sort of the challenge for that part of this. So in that sense, as Arjen highlights, the examples are really important as an entry point, but they require a student to be willing to be engaging in things they might not have thought about immediately before.
Thank you very much, both of you, for speaking to that question. I have another one which just came through on the question and answer box. This one is from James Speaks, and he's asking, have you observed a lack of public policy knowledge when civics or government has not been introduced at the high school level? And should this be a required course at first year of college?
Shall I give this a go, Arjen?
Yeah, I want to do that too.
Okay, we both go. Okay, so we both want to do that. So, well, let me go first then. You last one, go. So I think here, so I think there's sort of two questions to this. One is usually, so people who do, let's say, kind of school leaving stuff in the area of social science and politics don't really look at policy making. I mean, they might look at systems of government and so on, usually in a highly formal way. They might look at parties, they might look at elections a bit, but they don't really get policy making. That is something that really hits you more or less at university at some point in 1 year, two or three in that sense. This book is largely, you might say, for year one or for degrees where policy making is part of the non so optional menu, but might be not sort of core of the discipline, you may want to say. And I think therefore this book doesn't presume knowledge of the government and politics of country X and such like. I think policy making cuts across these kind of concerns. I mean, I may abuse that question and say, do I think every student should be taking a course in public policy making as year one? Then of course I would say yes, but I might be a bit biased on that. In fact, my own institution, London School of Economics, used to have compulsory course in public administration for every first year undergraduate. But that was
I would just briefly underwrite what Martin is saying, that I'm no longer surprised because it happens every year. But if I have a student of a group of let's say 100 to 150 students, 18-year-olds who come from we might assume very good high schools in Holland, their knowledge of what a policy is, they have no idea, and certainly not how it comes about. Government is sort of a mass entity, and they really have very little ideas about what that is. So part of when you talk about policymaking, you really can't escape also talking about what government is and how that relates, politics, administration. So all those debates we incorporate. So our book is a little wider than just policy making, because we have to bring in key concepts from public administration, but also from political science, to set the scene, if it were, and bring in these classic themes. For instance, between the relation between politics and administration, because you can't really understand that world if you don't understand the debate that's been very old and very classic, and that not always enters in policy books. But we think these topics need a place, and they did get a place in this book.
Thank you very much for answering that question as well. I have another one which came through in advance from the registration form. And this one is from Jaime, who's at the School of Public Health in Spain. And he's asking, could you please speak to some health policy cases? What is the situation with health policy? And is there anything on that one?
Well, and thank you. Another great question. So we in the book we actually talk quite a bit about public health issues, problems, challenges, whatever you want to call them. And that's logically because we kind of rode through COVID, and it was almost hard to not see many things through the COVID lens. So COVID is one of the issues, or public health issues, and that goes from at the one hand, the importance of trust. If you want to manage public health, but also specifically, we talk about the case of the vaccination issue. So the no jab, no play policy that was before COVID was introduced in Australia, and how important that is for policymakers to consider the different angles there: ethical angles, instrumental angles, political angles. All the way back to the AIDS issue in the United States, where you've seen this massive long-term neglect of a building public health issue crisis, we would almost say. So that also gets quite a bit of play in our book. So public health is certainly returns in various moments in the book.
Thank you for speaking to that. Very important topic too. Another question which was asked on the live Q&A is from Herman. He's asking, does your book discuss private and self-regulation and co-regulation, and consider the role of firms and market actors as policymakers?
Well, first of all, it's nice to hear from Herman. So shout out to Herman. And the answer would be not as explicitly, so we don't do a chapter on firms and markets and hierarchies or along those lines. First of all, because in it's an introductory book like that, that's typical one of the topics that is a little harder to bring across as a topic in itself. But what we do is, and I think importantly, throughout the book, we keep reminding our students that policymakers don't operate in a vacuum or in an ivory tower where they can just determine what's going to happen, and that they have to work with, for instance, companies, that they can be subjected to the vagaries of a market. Again, COVID, bring up the whole example of COVID, where policymakers relied on markets to provide all sorts of, like face masks and other critical resources needed during the which you can just sort of make happen as a government. Now, self-regulation, we sort of bring that into the idea that people organize themselves. It's not just, they don't always need to be organized. And so this is where we draw from sociology, for instance, and we show these young people that you have to work with people the way they organize. So I don't think we necessarily use that term self-regulation, but I would say in the spirit of that, we would certainly embrace it. And of course, we do talk about regulation, for sure, but that's more of as a tool, and the pros and cons, and the consequences it can have, both desired and undesired, intended and unintended. But if you're looking for a specific chapter on exactly along those lines, very specific sort of economic point of view, then we don't have it.
But it's fair to say what the important part, to use a slight variant on the question, just to re-emphasize the points. The book recognizes that policy making happens across many entities. It's not exclusively a government activity. So someone who will end up in a firm and such like will, who is part of a policy making process, will benefit from reading this book, or having read this book, in order to contribute to the policy-making process, not necessarily within government.
Thank you very much, both, for answering to that question. Another question which came through, actually, this is from Vasileios, and they've asked two questions, actually. So I'll just take one of them for now. And this is, does your book examine the extent to which policymakers behave on both domestic and European / international levels?
Yes, it sure does. We have a whole chapter on that, because we want to make sure that, but not just in the chapter, it keeps coming back, that because in our chapter 2, for instance, we explain that many of the problems that policymakers face are transboundary in nature, meaning to say they might originate far away in another system, another country. You're dealing with the consequences, but you can't really attack the source of it. And that's very problematic for policymakers. So we're sketching a world that is boundaryless. And whether we're talking about the EU or supply chain problems because of inflation, or cyberspace, is by definition boundaryless. So we from the very beginning, we try to point out, you may be living in a specific country or a specific local entity, national entity, but you are operating in a much wider space if you want to initiate policy that has an effect, a desired effect. And then later on, we bring the student to the international, so what are international organizations, why are they important, what are the limitations of international organizations, and what might be the future of international organizations in terms of policymaking. So I would say, yes, we cover that quite extensively throughout the book.
Thank you. Another question which came through on the Q&A just now is from Wyatt. And this question is, does the book offer insights into how to promote interdisciplinary approaches in public policy from a practical standpoint?
I mean, I think there's sort of one point I would say on that, and Arjen can correct me again or amend accordingly. I think the book draws on, as Arjen highlighted in the introductory contribution, that the book draws on many different fields. And that is what I personally love about sort of public policy. It's a bringing together. So while the book, I think, doesn't sort of make a strong claim about, this is interdisciplinary and why we should study it, it is interdisciplinary. So by reading it, one has an interdisciplinary approach to public policy, but there's no such thing as a long debate about why we need to be interdisciplinary as such. So Arjen, does that make sense? What I'm trying to highlight?
But you may be forgetting about the last chapter when we were talking about sort of the what in our minds, if we would create our little policy school, and we would define what the perfect policymaker would have to learn, and the kind of skills, and this we explicitly say, it's important to take your knowledge from different fields. And of course, if scholars, if you're a policymaking scholar, you're almost by nature interdisciplinary, but that doesn't mean policymakers are interdisciplinary. And I think it's a mindset, and it's a sort of to be open-minded, that if you're an economist, hey, you might actually learn something from an anthropologist. And it's good to have different people working together with different viewpoints. So in interdisciplinary is, to me, not just about academic or theoretical interdisciplinarity, but it's a mindset of, these problems, they require so many different angles, so many different knowledge sources, that if you really want to be successful, you have to be able to draw from different wells. And that's a skill in and of itself. I think most universities are catering to that nowadays. But the idea that you be a highly specialist, let's say, you only understand epidemics. The COVID has shown that you can't be a successful policymaker if you're just a hyper specialist and you think that's going to solve everything. And so I think we're making that point. Yes.
Thank you very much for addressing that question. We have time for one last question now, I think. And this one was asked in the question and answer box, and it's from Ethol again. And they're asking, does this book address policymaking in non-democratic states?
It does, but not, so to begin with, we're not specialists on policymaking in non-democratic states, but students ask that question often, because students are sort of they think there's a sort of hey, wouldn't it be cool if you had all the power and you don't have to go through all these democratic hoops and processes, that maybe you can do more. And we return quite explicitly to that question in our chapter on legitimacy, where we explain that in all states, there's also the non-democratic states, legitimacy is still key. It is still very important. So if legitimacy disappears, then you can only rely on brute power. And again, so we're drawing from political science here to sort of disabuse the notion that there is a romantic side to that. But also, at the same time, it is clear that in non-democratic states, certain policy aims are certainly achieved. I mean, that's undeniable. And but I think legitimacy is a key concept in a discussion like that. And so we do go there, yes, with a bit of caution.
Thank you very much.
And there was Fauzi, there was one question. Can I just briefly in the chat about simulations and?
Oh yes, if we have time, yes, please.
Yeah, I mean very briefly.
Yes,
okay, so
please.
we don't create simulations in the book, but we do like the thought experiments, and sort of creating a problem in the book and taking the student along the lines, like, imagine you have to deal with this kind of problem. How would you deal with that? And kind of walk the students through the steps of that, which I think can be used quite usefully in a classroom. We had a reference to in the book to a very nice little simulation tool that was online about, hey, if you're a policymaker that solves certain things, and then were you going to get fired or not if you did it right. Unfortunately, the problem with those things is if you put it in a book, you put a link and it's going to disappear. before the book's even out, or but we both use simulations a lot in our teaching. So we made sure that in the assignments that that's a sort of a base where you can start using and go down that road, where you can build classroom discussions on scenarios and apply insights from book. I like that question, and because it's really important to engage the students and not just talk to them all the time. Yes.
Thank you very much for speaking to that. And thank you also, Martin, for your time in taking those questions from the participants. So that actually is all we actually have time for now, but it's been a very, very fantastic session, very engaging, and you've covered off all of those, fantastic reasons why it's so important to engage the younger generation in policymaking and to engage tomorrow's students in this field. I just want to very quickly remind everybody that don't forget to visit our webpage, and you'll see the link on the screen there. You can find out more about Arjen and Martin's new textbook, The Politics of Policymaking, is coming out at the end of this month. And to celebrate the first Politics webinar week and the launch of this book, we're offering a 25% discount if you use the code PolWebWeek when you go to our checkout at www.sagepub.co.uk. And if you're a lecturer or a module leader, you can actually request an electronic inspection copy from our webpage too by just clicking the link on the QR code. We will be sending you out a webinar recording link over the coming weeks. So if you want to, you can watch this webinar again, or please do share it with some colleagues who might have missed it and that would be interested. I just want to share something on the next slide, actually, please, if I may. I'd like to share this opportunity to share some information about SAGE policy profiles. This is a new free tool from SAGE, which helps academics and researchers to track where their work has been cited in policy from governments, think tanks, and policymakers across the world. So if you're interested in checking that out, just visit policyprofiles.sagepub.com. And just to wrap up now, a huge thank you to Arjen, to Martin for their time today and their very illuminating presentation and discussion on policymaking. And thank you to Georgina for helping to facilitate the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a lovely rest of the day.